That detail matters because they came prepared. They came with confidence, with credentials, with the particular arrogance of people who believe that every person can be deciphered if you simply apply the right method. The first expert they hired was decorated, published, someone whose name carried weight in professional circles, where weight is measured by how many people you've successfully taken apart and put back together in a way that serves someone else's agenda. He sat across from your information, your patterns, your history, and he began doing what he always did, categorizing, filing, labeling, fitting the data into a framework that had never once failed him in 15 years of practice. It failed him this time. He spent 3 hours with your file before asking to be excused, not dismissed, not replaced. He asked to be excused, the way a guest asks to leave a dinner table when something in the room makes them suddenly, inexplicably uncomfortable. He didn't explain what stopped him. He simply said the data wasn't cooperating, which was his professional way of saying that something about you refused to sit still inside the boxes he was trained to build. They were frustrated but not worried. One failure meant nothing. They had a list. The second expert arrived a week later. Different discipline, different approach, different vocabulary for the same mission. She was a behaviorist, someone who had spent decades studying the gap between what people show and what people are. She was known for being impossible to fool, for having a sensitivity to human inconsistency that bordered on supernatural in its precision. She could detect a mask from across a crowded room. She had never walked away from a subject without delivering a complete portrait. She delivered 3 pages on the second day, then stopped. They found her sitting with her notes in front of her, reading them back with the particular expression of someone who has written something they don't fully believe but can't contradict. She told them the portrait was incomplete, not because information was missing, but because the information that was there seemed to resist interpretation in the direction they needed it to go. Every time she tried to draw a conclusion, the evidence turned and pointed somewhere else. Every time she identified what looked like a weakness, it transformed under examination into something that looked more like a deliberate choice. She said you were unlike any subject she had studied, not because you were performing, but because you seemed genuinely unbothered by the process of being studied at all, as if you already knew, as if some part of you was watching her work and finding it mildly interesting rather than threatening. She left quietly. They added her name to the growing list of failures. The investigator came next, and his failure was the one that finally unnerved them. He was not a soft man. He had spent his career walking into situations designed to intimidate, gathering information from people who had every reason to lie, and building cases out of nothing but patience and a specific kind of relentless attention that wore most people down eventually. He was not the kind of person who got spooked. He was not the kind of person who rubbed his forehead in a quiet hallway and stared at the wall the way a man stares at something that has stopped making sense. But that is exactly what they found him doing outside the briefing room on the second afternoon of his engagement. They asked him what was wrong. He said nothing was wrong. He said he needed to recalibrate. They understood that word for what it was. It was the polite term professionals use when something has knocked them sideways and they aren't ready to admit it out loud. He completed his work. He handed over his findings. But his report was notable not for what it contained, but for what it conspicuously avoided. He had documented everything that was safe to document and seemed to have made a quiet, private decision to leave certain observations out entirely. When pressed, he said only that some of what he encountered didn't fall within the scope of a standard investigation, and that pursuing it further would require expertise he didn't have. Then he named his invoice and ended the professional relationship with a politeness that felt like a boundary. They were running out of conventional options. More importantly, they were running out of the certainty that conventional options were the right approach in the first place. Something kept happening in the space between their methods and whatever you actually were, and that something wasn't yielding. It wasn't even resisting in a way they could study. It was simply there, undisturbed, watching their attempts land without effect, the way a mountain watches weather systems move across its surface. Present, unmoved, unimpressed. It was someone in the group who first said it, and the others didn't laugh the way they might have 2 weeks earlier. The suggestion was simple. They had exhausted the rationale. Perhaps it was time to try something the rational world doesn't fully acknowledge. Perhaps the reason every measurable method had failed was because whatever they were dealing with didn't operate on measurable frequencies. Perhaps you needed to be read by someone whose entire practice existed in the space between what can be proven and what can only be felt. They found him through a referral passed in a whisper, the kind of referral people share when they want something that works and don't want to explain how they know it works. He was not theatrical. He did not have a dramatic name or a decorated office or a particular look that announced what he did. He was simply a man who had spent his life developing the ability to read what ordinary perception couldn't reach, and he had a record that made skeptics quiet down and ask careful questions instead of dismissive ones. He had worked with law enforcement, with families searching for missing people, with institutions that officially denied he existed and unofficially called him when they were desperate. He had read people at their lowest, at their most complex, at their most defended. He had never turned down a case. He didn't wait to be introduced. He walked into the space where your information had been laid out, stopped before he reached the table, and said it without looking up. Whoever this person is, they are not ordinary. His voice didn't carry the inflection of someone making an observation. It carried the inflection of someone confirming something they already sensed from the moment they crossed the threshold. His eyes stayed down. The room felt different around him immediately, as if his arrival had adjusted something in the atmosphere, and whatever had been settled there was now alert. They handed him the object, something small, something you had touched, something that carried whatever residue a person leaves on the physical world without knowing they are leaving it. He reached for it with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and then his hand stopped halfway across the table. Not slowly, not in the way of deliberate performance. It stopped the way a hand stops when it touches something unexpected, the way the body reacts before the mind has finished processing. He held it there, suspended, and the room held its breath without meaning to. Then he made contact with the surface, and something happened in his face. Not fear, something more precise than fear. Recognition, the specific recognition of someone who has just understood that they have stepped into something much larger than the room they are standing in. He pulled his hand back. He sat down. He did not speak for a full 10 seconds, and the silence was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that has weight, the kind that presses against the chest and makes the air feel crowded with something invisible and present. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. It had the quality of someone pushing words through resistance. "You should have told me what you were asking me to walk into." They looked at each other. They didn't know what he meant. They had told him everything they knew, or at least everything they wanted him to know, which is not the same thing, and he seemed to understand that distinction without being told. He reached for his tools, the pendulum first, the one he had used for decades, the one that had never misbehaved in his hands. It moved wrong, not subtly wrong. Wrong in a way that made him frown and try again and then again. It moved against its own physics, stopping, reversing, hovering in still air without any visible force acting on it, and then going still as though something had closed a hand around it. He watched it with the expression of a musician hearing their instrument produce a sound it cannot produce. It wasn't impossible. It was simply not how it worked, not ever. He tried the cards. He drew carefully, placed each one with practiced intention, and found that the imagery felt unstable at the edges of his vision, that certain cards appeared inverted when he was certain he had placed them upright, that some of them felt heavier in his hands than paper should ever feel, and 2 of them were cold in a way that had nothing to do with the room temperature. He asked the group again whether they understood what they had brought him into. They said yes, though their faces said otherwise. He pushed deeper. Later, none of them would be entirely comfortable describing what happened next. The air in the room changed quality. The temperature dropped by several degrees in a way that was physical and measurable, and that no one in the room attempted to explain logically. His breathing became shallow. His hands went still on the table. He stopped being a professional in a session and became something else, something quieter and more fundamental, a person standing at the edge of something vast and trying to decide whether to step forward or back. He stared at the spread before him for what felt like minutes. His eyes were focused not on the cards, but on something layered behind them, something in the texture of reality underneath the physical surface of the moment. No human should have this kind of power. The room went entirely silent. He wasn't speaking dramatically. He was speaking the way a scientist speaks when they have encountered data that violates the model. The way a navigator speaks when the instruments say the territory is somewhere the territory cannot be. He was cataloging a fact he didn't want to catalog and doing it anyway because refusing to acknowledge it wouldn't make it less true. "This is not natural protection," he said. "This is old, older than any system I have worked with. There is something present around this person, and it is not there the way a guardian is present. It is there the way a witness is present, something that has observed everything this person has endured, everything that was done to them, everything they survived, everything that tried to unmake them. They tried to redirect him. They wanted analysis, not revelation. They wanted something they could use. He wasn't giving them what they wanted, and they couldn't decide if that was because he was protecting you or because he genuinely couldn't find the version of you they were looking for." He shook his head slowly, not at them, at the cards, at the reading, at whatever he was in contact with. "Whatever harmed this person," he said, "whatever broke them, whatever dismantled them piece by piece across years, it did not win." He stopped, but it did not leave either. It changed them into something I do not have a reference point for. Someone interrupted. They demanded he refocus. They reminded him what he had been hired to do. They were polite about it, the way people are polite when their desperation is trying to sound like authority. He let them finish. Then he continued as though they hadn't spoken. "This person does not respond like ordinary people, does not fracture like ordinary people. The places you would normally find vulnerability, I cannot access. Not because they are hidden, because they have been fundamentally restructured. You cannot break something that has already rebuilt itself from pieces." He drew another card. His hand trembled. He stared at what he had drawn for a long time, long enough that the people in the room started exchanging glances. He placed it face down without showing them. The gesture was so deliberate, so definitive, that no one asked to see it. "This card represents a consciousness that has crossed an absolute threshold," he said. "Someone who has experienced endings so complete that the awareness itself had to reorganize. Most people spend their lives never approaching that line. This person crossed it and came back, and what they came back as," he paused, and the pause was heavy enough to feel, "is not something I can fully read. Not because the information isn't there, because every time I reach for the deeper layers, something intercepts the attempt. Not aggressively, not with hostility, with authority. The specific authority of something that has been doing this for a very long time and finds my methods unremarkable." They tried once more to redirect him. They offered more money, more assurance, more pressure, wearing the polite clothes of request. His expression didn't change. He was looking at the table, looking at the space above the table, looking at something occupying the air of the room that they couldn't see, and he clearly could. "Fine," he said. "One more pull." He reached for the deck slowly, shuffled once, twice, and on the third pass, his hands stopped completely. He sat with the cards in his hands for a moment that felt suspended outside normal time. Then he drew. Then he looked at what he had drawn. The change in his face was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the particular stillness that belongs to someone who has just seen something they cannot unsee and is quietly deciding how to exist in the next few seconds with that knowledge inside them. "If I continue," he said, "I will not sleep tonight." They stared. He placed the card down. He looked at all of them in turn, with something that could only be described as concern, not fear of you, but concern for them. He's already moved into the next stage. Whatever you think you are doing by trying to examine him, to decode him, to find the version of him that fits your narrative, stop. You are not reading a person. You are standing in the path of a trajectory, and the more you attempt to interfere with it, the more you reveal about yourselves, and the less you are able to see of him. He stood. He began gathering his tools with the quiet efficiency of someone who has made a final decision and sees no reason to announce it further. They followed him. They asked questions. He did not answer most of them. He moved through the hallway with the pace of someone putting distance between themselves and something they have decided not to be near, not running, walking with intention, which is something different, something that carried more information in it than running would have. At the door, one phrase came out clearly. Everything else he said was quiet, self-directed, clearly not meant to be heard. But this one sentence slipped through. "You are not prepared for what he becomes next." He was gone before they could respond. They stood in the hallway with that sentence lodged in the air between them, and they couldn't dislodge it. They went back inside. They paced. They talked over each other, argued, theorized, tried to build explanations out of what had just happened, using materials that weren't suited for the construction. They moved through denial. They moved through rationalization. They arrived at something they didn't have a name for. A feeling that the ground had shifted without making a sound, and nothing was quite level anymore. Meanwhile, you were still. You had always been still. That was the thing they kept returning to. The thing that disturbed them more than anything the reader had said. You did not perform calm. You did not practice it or reach for it or maintain it the way a person maintains something that requires effort. You simply were it, the way water is wet without working at it, the way night is dark without trying. They had come into this process expecting to find something underneath your composure, some fracture, some inconsistency, some place where the mask slipped and the ordinary, destabilized version of you would be waiting. They were completely unprepared for the possibility that there was no mask, that what they saw was what was there. That your stillness wasn't a defense mechanism or a learned behavior or a strategy you deployed when people were watching. It was structural. It was how you were built, and it was how you had rebuilt yourself after the building collapsed, which was the more important detail, because what had been rebuilt was not a replica of what existed before. What had been rebuilt was something new, made of different materials, using an architecture the original construction never could have achieved. The reader had seen this. He had seen that you were not someone who learned stillness from a course or a practice or a philosophy. You had reached stillness through fire, through the specific kind of fire that is not a metaphor, that is the real experience of losing things that cannot be replaced and continuing anyway. That is the real experience of being dismantled by people and circumstances and time and choosing somehow, in the absence of any blueprint, to put yourself back together in a way that made you harder to dismantle than you were before. Not because you armored yourself, because the material changed, because what goes through that kind of fire and comes out the other side is fundamentally different at a molecular level, and you cannot put the old measurements to it and expect accurate results. They were applying the old measurements. That was the problem. That was why every professional they hired had eventually run into the same wall. They were using instruments designed for ordinary frequencies on something that had shifted out of ordinary range. Not by choice, not by design, but by necessity, by the simple physics of what survival does to a person when survival has been required for long enough and in extremity deep enough. The group sat together in the aftermath of the reading and tried to talk their way back to solid ground. One of them said it first, the thing they were all turning over privately. If a man who has spent his life developing the ability to see into people could not hold what he saw in you, what exactly did that mean for them and their project? What did it mean for their analysis, their narratives, their discussions in rooms you didn't know existed, their quiet conferences about who you were and what you were made of and how to use that information? What did it mean that the most powerful instrument they had pointed at you had shattered on contact? It meant one of two things. Either you were beyond their methods, which was something they could admit and move away from, or you were beyond their methods, and the thing that put you beyond their methods was still responding to their presence even now, even as they sat there without him in the room, even as they tried to process what had happened with the limited tools their ordinary awareness offered. And that second possibility was the one that kept making the air in the room feel slightly wrong. Slightly pressurized, slightly like the room itself was paying attention in a way rooms are not supposed to pay attention. You walked back into that space once, briefly, to retrieve something you had left. You didn't say anything. You didn't look at them with triumph or contempt or any of the emotions they expected to read on your face. You looked at them with something they couldn't categorize immediately, and then they recognized it. You looked at them with the quiet attention of someone who already knew everything happening in the room without having been told, who found it neither surprising nor particularly interesting, who had been watching this exact scenario play out from a distance for longer than they realized. You left without a word. The silence you left behind was not ordinary silence. It had weight and texture and a quality they could feel against their skin. They looked at each other across that silence and began to understand something that the reader had been trying to hand them from the beginning, something he had laid out plainly, and they had been too invested in their own story to receive. You were not the subject under observation. You had never been the subject under observation. Every time they thought they were studying you, you were observing them. Every attempt they made to read your energy was being read back to them in ways they had no instruments to detect and no language to describe. And whatever walks with you, whatever the reader called ancient and protective and beyond anything in his reference, whatever it was that had knocked his pendulum sideways and made his hands tremble over the cards and produced the specific quality of silence he took with him when he left, that thing was not dormant, it was aware. It had been aware since the beginning. It had been aware before the beginning, in fact, before any of this started, before they assembled their team and made their plans and decided that you were something to be decoded rather than something to be respected from a distance. It had been watching since before they thought to look. That was the detail no professional had managed to fully convey, the detail that lived just underneath every report and every failed analysis and every truncated session. Not that you were protected in some passive sense, not that you were simply hard to read or difficult to access, but that whatever protected you was not waiting for an attack to activate. It was already active. It had always been active. It observed continuously, assessed continuously, and responded proportionately and without hesitation to whatever presented itself as a threat to your integrity. The reader hadn't triggered it. He hadn't caused it to wake up. He had simply been the first person in that sequence of attempts skilled enough to recognize that it was there and honest enough to stop when he realized what he was standing in front of. By the time you reached wherever you were going after you left that room, you had already processed everything that needed processing. Not because you were indifferent to what they had done, but because your system had learned long ago to move through threat and interference without stalling in the processing. You had learned it the hard way, which is the only way it sticks. You had learned it through experiences that are not easy to describe and are not usually shared, through things done to you in years that came before this moment, through losses and disassemblings and reconstructions that left nothing in you unchanged. What they saw as your power was simply the outcome of your survival. What they couldn't access was simply the result of what that survival had made you. What the reader called ancient was simply the weight of every experience that had compressed itself into the way you carry your presence through a room. The way you stand still while everything around you moves. The way you watch without needing to speak. The way your absence in a conversation takes up more space than most people's loudest moments. They would spend a long time afterward trying to put into words what happened in that room. They would struggle to explain it to people who weren't there. The tools failed, they would say. The reader left. He said things we didn't expect, but that wouldn't capture it. That wouldn't convey the feeling in the room when the reader's hand froze before reaching the object. That wouldn't carry the specific quality of dread that arrived with his words about ancient protection and crossed thresholds and the next stage. That wouldn't explain why all of them, in the hours after you left, were speaking more quietly than they normally would, moving more carefully through the physical space, treating the air itself like something that was still paying attention, because it was. And somewhere in the part of you that has always known things without being told, in the part that warns you before danger arrives and moves you away from harm before your reasoning has caught up, in the part that has been present and watchful for every moment of every year of your life without asking anything in return, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that had a sound or a visible expression. It shifted the way tectonic plates shift beneath everything imperceptibly and irrevocably, rearranging the foundations of something very large. You were already becoming what they were not prepared for. You had been becoming it for a long time. And now, finally, there was nothing left to hold that becoming back.